Okay, I want to break down a little bit of our philosophy, especially for new players coming onto the plan. You know, you're going to come through a sequence of a few weeks at the beginning, and I always say on the onboarding call, talk to you a little bit about efficiency, joint alignment, the basics. We pin everything on our fundamentals, which is movement, which is the ability, or having bones here, to be in a good neutral position. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect. I think that a few years ago I would have been a bit, you know, that foot's got to toe in and we've got to have perfection. We're not the kind of, I say this all the time, we're not the movement police. Like, there are natural asymmetries that happen within the body, and a good example would be the right side of the body is heavier. You've got the liver, you've got a bigger domed diaphragm on the right hand side. So because of that, we've got all these push-pull effects and biases going on within the human body that move our skeleton into different positions. The problem is that some of these positions that we find ourselves in, they often rob us of movement because we might not be in a great position within the joint capsule itself. So when we look at the first sort of phases with us, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to you a little bit around why we start with the pelvis and the relationship between the pelvis and the rib cage. So we know from the beginning and talking on the program that every single joint has a job description in the human body. The problem occurs is when it's not doing what it's designed to do. This operating system here runs the show, so it has to work out what resources it has at joint level. It is not going to stop functioning. You're not going to stop running into bowl just because you've lost a bit of hip range of motion or because the rib cage has lost a bit of right or left rotation. He'll just figure out, well, this doesn't move, I'm going to get this to move, or maybe this to move, and this is why we have problems. That's why pain, where you just wake up one day and there's a niggle, is a symptom of something else within the system. So let me talk to you about the pelvis. And this is why, again, 90% of the players on our program are not professional cricketers. They have day jobs, they all have life, we all live a certain way, which means we're sitting far more frequently. Now that means in real terms that if this is my pelvis, I'm going to have a pelvis that's rotated slightly forward. Okay, if I draw the bottom half. Now because of that, if I drew a line straight up from my spine, we would end up, if we were working in straight lines, literally looking down. So you'd be like this. Well, we can't be in that position. We can actually be in this position, and we normally are if we're working on a laptop or if we're looking in this or looking at our phones. But what we do is the brain goes, I need to look what's coming, and that's how I live. That extension pattern. So if we draw that onto the board, we've got this exaggerated extension within the lumbar spine, which means that the vertebrae are closer together, and that's why I have such a problem with loading that pattern. So if you think about what a barbell is going to do, if you think about what a barbell is actually going to do to the spine, you're just going to compress it. Think about sprinting. Think about every single thing that we do that's now putting force through that lumbar spine. It's no good. So the first thing that we have to do is understand that we need to reorientate the pelvis. We have to get the pelvis more neutral. Not perfect, but just not rotated so far forward. Because if we can get the pelvis to sit back, it means that we can take out this extension within the lumbar spine and we can stack the rib cage over the pelvis. You're never going to get a good position of the rib cage, and you're never going to get a good position at the shoulder itself until you reorientate the pelvis and then the rib cage. This is where I see so many people going wrong, is that they have shoulder limitations and shoulder restrictions. They are that person in extension. They literally go straight to, oh, I can't get overhead, so now I'm going to tackle the shoulder and the rib cage, but you leave the pelvis. So you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul all the time, because the pelvis is the fulcrum place. It's the place that dictates everything within function itself. So this is why we have to spend time reorientating the pelvis, getting that rib cage to sit down nicely above. There are certain things in medical terms or physiotherapy terms like upper and lower cross syndrome. It's basically, that's a byproduct of a pelvis that's rotated forward and a sequence of positions that the muscles get in or get stuck in that dictate poor function. So we see it all the time. We see that kind of lower cross syndrome where hip flexors are sore all the time. They feel tight, they're not. Hamstrings are tight. You've got weak glutes. Abdominals are just not really engaging, and we're in that overextended position. And if you go into any gym, that's probably 90% of people. But from a cricketing point of view, and we'll always talk about this throughout the program, is we get players that will come into HQ here. We will do some jump assessments, single leg drop jumps at the beginning of the session. We'll then just do some simple corrective work, and within 10 minutes, they'll actually increase their force production and output. So they haven't got stronger, they haven't grown muscle, they haven't done anything except for got the pelvis in a better position, the joints more central, and as soon as the skeleton is in that position, you're able to express force. So now, the other thing I want to kind of talk about a little bit is that if you go and spend 6 hours in a car or a long flight or a really crappy hotel room, or maybe you just get ill, this structure is moving all the time. It's fluid. It's continually moving and adapting and changing. So you've got to have ways to check in with yourself. You've got to have ways, this is why we assess on a monthly basis. But to be honest with you, I'm starting to talk to players a little bit more around, you know what, just touch base with yourself once a week. You know, have a look and see, are you in good range of motion? What else do you need to do to make sure that this pelvis and this rib cage are stacked on top of each other? Sometimes as you can hardwire into yourself, how am I standing? You're standing in a queue. Am I shifted to one direction? Is my weight forward? Is it back? Just develop an innate sense within the body of where you're positioning. And to be fair, in all honesty, it's just how you deal with your own weight. It's how you develop a sensory system to make sure that your weight is always within your center of mass, is within your base of support. Ask yourself, because that's what posture is really. It's just okay, if I shift my weight to the right hand side and look down, I'm probably going to have to do this just to look forward. So it's always about weight shift. So if you're somebody who is sitting for countless hours, I had a question yesterday, it was like, well, I've got a standing desk, I'm fine. Well, you're not fine, because you're actually now, you're that person in lumbar extension, you're just standing at a desk now with the arch in the spine. So we need to be able to reset the pelvis to get good rib cage positioning and function. That's why always we'll come back to talk about this. Now, the early sessions that you go through with us, I always hear this from guys after their sort of first month call, same sort of thing is like, I get weird looks in the gym, some of these exercises they've never seen before. Let me talk about the philosophy of the correction of the posture. So you would have seen some of the correctives we use are from the DNS camp. DNS is dynamic neuromuscular stabilization. It's basically repatterning movement in the same way that babies, the first movement operating system, babies learn to move. So if you think about the only thing that children or kids often do is they copy and they mimic, is how they learn, but all they're looking at is mum and dad walking around. We don't, as mums and dads, crawl around the floor with our kids, but how do kids know to transition from one particular posture to the next? So they'll go from getting head and neck control. How many people have got this like hunchback of Notre Dame lump on the back of their neck growing? In probably about 50 years time, we're all going to be like this. This is what they call text neck, which is that ridge that sits at the back of the bulge at the back of the spine. So the first thing that kids do is they learn to get head and neck control. I understand why you see all these pictures on the internet, look at a perfect squat on a 2-year-old. Well, the 2-year-old has got a head the size of a massive bowling ball. It's a third of their bodies. If you want to squat better, put a motorcycle helmet on. It helps. It's a counterbalance. So just forget that for a minute. But a kid has got to get massive control of this big, big lump on their shoulders, compressing down. So the first thing they do is they get head and neck control. Then you lay the baby on the floor. The baby works out rolling from front to back and back. Now that's where we're actually working on rotational, but motor control. We're working on more core rotational control. Can I move myself from front to back, back to front? That's why so many people, we test for it. We test for it because actually it's a very good indicator as to what's going on with the deep core stabilizers to see whether or not we're able to drive movement. So many people that we assess, we put them on the floor, we ask them to roll, and it's like, I can't do it. There you go, that's one of the reasons. So once they get rolling, they then are able to get themselves up into postures, whether it's just a kneeling posture, a sitting posture, a side posture. The interesting thing that they do before they load the hips is they load the shoulder. Now this is the thing I want to explain here a little bit and why we're still seeing shoulder problems. We're seeing our hips are loaded all the time. As adults, they're loaded with barbells, everything's loaded. But babies load the shoulders because what they do is they're sitting in positions and they're leaning on an elbow. They're pushing their hands down on the ground. So they're getting these distraction forces within, well, the rotator cuff within the shoulder itself, which to me makes a lot of sense because I'm like, well, yeah, it's the head first. Then I've got to get some strength and some control within the shoulder itself because our hands and arms are crucial to survival. And I think that there's this underlying survival mechanism that's built into the human race. So hands and arms and being able to grab and feel, that is going to be massively important. Yes, I need to be able to get to my feet and run and chase things, but hands are first on the list and we neglect this. After we get to the place where kids go through these transitional postures, they can actually push up into a half a kneeling position or a tall kneeling position. Now we're loading the hips. Now we're able to crawl. So crawling is a fantastic corrective tool because as we're crawling, not only am I loading the hips now, I'm loading the shoulder at the same time, and I'm actually gaining supported control of my spine. So if you can picture, it's almost like, you know, I've got here's the shoulder, here's the hips. It's almost like a hammock in between. That's the spine. I've got to be able to develop the positioning of that spine and keep it neutral as I'm moving. So crawling is a key thing. After crawling, they don't stand up. They go to perhaps a sofa and they pull themselves up and they creep. They go sideways. Now we're building in lateral stability in a upright position where the spine is already supported. And the final thing I've always found is fascinating is they don't jump forward, and before they walk, they climb up on stuff and they jump off. So they're training eccentrics, they're training control, and then they start to walk. So every baby goes through this process. This is how the first operating system for movement comes into play. So to me, it makes a hell of a lot of sense to dip back into the first system that's logged in this brain to re-pattern movement. So for me, it's all about, just in summary, we have to be very aware of the position of the pelvis, the position of the rib cage, and for us, there is no first phase and through that move on. This is a phase, understanding human motion and biomechanics to improve efficiency is the core of our program. We will always dip back into it to see exactly how your body is reacting. But those first strange exercises that you do in the gym where people are looking at you, that is what we're doing it for.